The forest floor in the Central European highlands holds its secrets close, covering the scars of history with a patient blanket of time. For decades, the area remained unremarkable, a dense wood of ancient oaks and beech, frequented only by hikers and the occasional wildlife surveyor. History has a way of refusing to stay buried, and in the late 1990s, the slow, relentless creep of urban expansion began to unearth things that had been deliberately hidden since the height of the Cold War. The first clue was a simple anomaly in the topography, a slight, unnatural rise in the earth, barely discernible beneath the thick layer of pine needles and damp leaf mold. It was here, during a routine geological survey preceding a new infrastructure project, that Allied surveyors stumbled upon a concrete hatch hidden beneath decades of soil and moss. This was no ordinary maintenance access point. When the thicket of brush was cleared and the moss scraped away, the discovery immediately arrested the surveyors. The hatch was massive, a solid square of rebar-reinforced concrete, its edges sealed against the elements with heavy, rusting steel gaskets. It didn't open with a simple handle, it was secured by 4 massive, custom-forged locking bolts that appeared to have been static for 30 years. The further inspection revealed the true nature of the find. The exposed portion of the structure, the entrance lip, the surrounding ventilation shafts, and the initial barrier of sealed steel doors, immediately signaled something unusual, a facility designed to withstand more than conventional warfare. These were not the flimsy defenses of a wartime air raid shelter. The steel was hardened, the concrete mixture heavy with dense aggregate, and the entrance angled obliquely, a deliberate design feature to deflect the force of a massive, directional blast wave. The ventilation shafts, barely wider than a man's torso, were shrouded in concrete cowls and pointed down into the earth. Their design was highly sophisticated, featuring multiple bends and baffles, indicating that the air drawn from the outside was intended to pass through elaborate filtration systems, not just simple screens. The entire structure whispered of military necessity, of immense resources, and, most terrifyingly, of nuclear survivability. The immediate confusion among the local authorities, who had no record of such a massive installation, quickly led to the involvement of national military intelligence. Within days, the site was cordoned off, marked by temporary fencing and silent, uniformed guards. The process of accessing the hidden complex was painstaking, requiring specialized hydraulic equipment to crack the rusty seals and move the multi-ton concrete lid. When the massive steel door finally yielded, a slow, grating screech of metal on metal, the air that rushed out was cold, stagnant, and chemically sterile, smelling faintly of diesel oil and institutional cleaning products. It was the preserved atmosphere of the 1960s, locked away and untouched. The subsequent investigation, tracing the obscure markings and non-standard engineering specifications, led to the gradual declassification of long-buried government files. Declassified records later revealed that this bunker was part of a covert Cold War continuity of government system, built for a catastrophic scenario that, thankfully, never arrived. This particular site was not a communications post, a missile silo, or a command center for a standing army. It was a redoubt, a sanctuary. Its code name, now released to history, was Project Kaltstall. Steel, a fortress designed not to fight the war, but to survive it, to ensure that the idea of the state, the essential function of governance, could be resurrected from the ruins. It was a monument to the logic of the apocalypse. To understand the immense effort, secrecy, and cost poured into Project Kaltstall, one must first grasp the terrifying psychological and political climate of its creation. The decade between 1955 and 1965 was defined by the relentless, terrifying escalation of the nuclear arms race. The testing of the hydrogen bomb by both the Soviet Union and the United States eliminated any lingering doubts about the scale of destruction that could be unleashed. The world was no longer simply preparing for war, it was preparing for global annihilation. During the 1950s and early 1960s, both NATO and the Warsaw Pact operated under the assumption that a nuclear exchange was not a distant possibility but a near inevitability. This wasn't military paranoia, it was strategic realism. The doctrine of mutual assured destruction meant that any conflict, however small, risked spiraling into a total exchange. The question for governments was not if the bombs would fall, but when, and how to ensure that the opposing power understood that even after absorbing a devastating first strike, retaliation would be certain. This need for guaranteed retaliation and post-strike governance drove the creation of the continuity of government COG infrastructure. Governments urgently commissioned underground shelters where essential personnel could survive the first strikes and coordinate retaliation. These bunkers were the ultimate insurance policy. They were designed for the darkest day, intended to hold the surviving core of the state's command authority, the president or premier, key cabinet members, authenticated military commanders, and the technical teams required to manage communication and strategic assets. Project Kaltstall was born directly from this strategic terror. Its construction began in the mid-1950s, a time when missile technology was rapidly shrinking the warning window for a first strike. The logic was simple: cities, the centers of political, economic, and military command, were targets. Survival required burrowing deep into protected, remote areas, far from the anticipated ground zeros of major urban and military centers. This site belonged to that era of escalating fear, constructed in secrecy, funded under obscure budget lines, and hidden from public knowledge. The level of secrecy surrounding Kaltstall was extreme, even by Cold War standards. The funding was laundered through the budgets of unrelated government departments, agricultural research, national highways, or telecommunications infrastructure. The construction team was entirely military, sworn to lifetime secrecy, and divided into small, compartmentalized teams. The workers digging the tunnels never knew who was pouring the concrete walls, and the engineers installing the filters never knew who was laying the secure communication cables. To the outside world, the site appeared, if visible at all, as a remote radar station or a geological survey facility. The necessity of secrecy was twofold. Deterrence. If the enemy knew the exact location of the COG bunkers, they would become immediate, priority targets, defeating the entire purpose of the system. Public order. Revealing the existence of such a structure, a deep, permanent refuge for the government, would have caused mass panic and undermined public confidence in the efficacy of surface-level civil defense measures. The government was preparing to survive, while the populace was being told to duck and cover. Its primary mission was simple: ensure the state survived even if its cities did not. This was the chilling, stark reality of Kaltstall. Its goal was not to save lives en masse, but to preserve the legal and functional integrity of the state. It was designed to house the constitutional authority, the authentication codes for the remaining nuclear arsenal, and the organizational charts for a post-apocalyptic attempt at reconstruction. The men who designed Kaltstall had to think through the entire spectrum of collapse: the blast, the firestorm, the massive earthquakes, the weeks of fallout, and the ultimate psychological pressure of knowing they were the few survivors tasked with leading a devastated nation. The bunker's engineering, its deep placement, its massive blast doors, its self-sustaining systems, was a physical representation of this strategic necessity. It was a fortress built against the future, standing as a testament to a time when hope was measured in cubic yards of reinforced concrete and the certainty of continued governance was the only thing standing between civilization and the void. The engineering of Project Kaltstall was a study in redundant, over-specified systems, the logical outcome of a design requirement that demanded absolute, non-negotiable survivability. The planners understood that the facility had to withstand not only the immediate blast but the subsequent environmental collapse. The blast shield. Going deep. The fundamental defense of Kaltstall was simple: depth. The facility was excavated deep into a massive, stable geological formation, a granite massif chosen for its compressive strength and minimal seismic activity. The primary living and command areas were situated over 200 meters, 650 feet below the surface. Shutterstock. The 200 meters of solid granite and limestone served as an immense blast shield. A surface nuclear detonation, even a high-yield hydrogen bomb, delivers energy through blast pressure, ground shock, and intense heat. Thick rock overburden was calculated to attenuate ground shock. The elasticity of the deep rock would absorb and dissipate the seismic waves traveling through the earth, minimizing structural damage within the bunker. Filter radiation. The density of the rock was the ultimate shield against gamma radiation and neutron flux, the immediate killers from a nuclear airburst. Furthermore, the immense layer protected the occupants from the lethal, long-term threat of radioactive fallout settling on the surface. The entrance, as discovered by the surveyors, was not a vertical drop, but a spiraling, reinforced access tunnel designed to minimize the force transmission of a surface blast wave. The tunnel's multiple, right-angle turns acted as blast traps, absorbing the concussive energy before it could reach the internal sealed environment. The air system. Breathing in the ashes. Life below ground hinged entirely on the ability to breathe clean, temperate air. The air management system of Kaltstall was the most complex and expensive single component of the project. The system operated in 3 critical modes: normal open cycle, drawing filtered, fresh air from the surface when the environment was safe; contaminated closed cycle. When fallout was detected, the exterior intake vents would slam shut under extreme pressure, sealing the bunker. The internal air would then be endlessly recirculated through the massive filtration chambers. Filtration chambers were lined with huge, multi-stage filter banks. Pre-filters. To remove bulk dust and debris. HEPA filters, high-efficiency particulate air, designed to physically scrub the air of microscopic radioactive particles down to sub-micron size. Activated charcoal beds. Massive banks of chemically treated charcoal designed to chemically bind and neutralize gaseous contaminants, most critically radioactive iodine-131, a major component of fallout that targets the thyroid. The system included redundant cooling towers to manage the heat generated by the dense population and constant running machinery, ensuring the internal temperature remained stable for weeks or months. The capacity was immense. Kaltstall was engineered to maintain breathable, life-sustaining air for up to 6 months without drawing a single breath from the surface. The power core, the heart of steel. Absolute self-sufficiency required absolute power. The generator rooms of Kaltstall were cathedral-like chambers, housing 3 massive, marine-grade diesel engines. These were chosen for their reliability and endurance, capable of running continuously for weeks with minimal maintenance. The engines were fed by vast, multi-chambered fuel storage tanks sunk into the bedrock surrounding the generator room. These tanks held enough reserve diesel to power the entire complex, lights, life support, communication systems, and pumps, for over 180 days. The sheer logistical challenge of secretly delivering and storing millions of liters of fuel was a task of engineering brilliance and security paranoia. The entire generator complex rested on massive vibration-dampening spring mounts, giant hydraulic shock absorbers designed to isolate the powerful rumble of the engines from the sensitive electronic and command equipment housed elsewhere. Kaltstall was more than just a hiding place. It was a self-contained, subterranean world designed to operate independently, a mechanical and geological island of governance designed to survive the cataclysmic storm. The commitment to national survival encapsulated in Project Kaltstall demanded a level of engineering effort that dwarfed most conventional military construction projects. This was not a quick shelter hastily dug during a panic. It was a permanent, hardened facility built with the cold, meticulous logic of engineers preparing for the end of the world. Its location was paramount, its construction deliberate, and its cost astronomical, justified only by the catastrophic stakes it was designed to mitigate. The bunker was carved deep into a natural rock formation to take advantage of natural radiation shielding. The geological survey that preceded construction was perhaps the most crucial phase of the entire project. Engineers sought a massive, stable granite massif, a dense, crystalline rock formation that offered maximum compressive strength and minimal seismic instability. The chosen location was geologically perfect, its stone strata providing an immense, inert barrier. The rock itself was the primary defense. Every foot of dense granite overburden offered protection against the gamma radiation and neutron flux from a nuclear detonation. The planners calculated that the 200 meters of solid rock above the command center would reduce the radiation dose rate by a factor of hundreds of thousands, rendering the immediate external environment harmless to the internal occupants. The rock was the first, best line of defense against the invisible killer of the atomic age. The excavation was a colossal, multi-year undertaking, conducted in absolute secrecy. Teams of specialized hard rock miners, working in 3 shifts, used techniques perfected in deep-level mining and tunnel boring, minimizing the visible surface disturbance. They employed smooth blasting techniques to create stable, precisely shaped tunnels and chambers, carefully managing the rock stress to prevent collapses or weaknesses that could be exploited by a blast wave. The entry point was the most vulnerable section, and its design reflected the obsession with preventing blast penetration. Engineers installed blast-resistant access tunnels, triple-layered blast doors, and concrete chambers designed to survive overpressures expected from megaton-class detonations. The access tunnel did not plunge vertically, which would have acted as a shock wave channel. Instead, it descended in a gentle, spiraling corkscrew pattern. At strategic points along this descent, 3 sets of massive steel doors were installed. These triple-layered blast doors were not merely heavy, they were complex, precision-machined pressure vessels. Each door, weighing several tons, was seated in a deeply recessed concrete frame and featured heavy-duty hydraulic sealing mechanisms. The first door, at the surface entrance, was designed to absorb the initial kinetic energy and heat of the blast wave. The second door, mid-tunnel, was designed to contain the pressure pulse and heat that penetrated the first. The third door, at the main habitat level, was the final seal, designed to withstand the residual pressure and ensure the sterile, controlled environment within the bunker remained intact. The chambers themselves were shaped with arched roofs and curved walls, distributing the immense shock wave pressures evenly, preventing single points of structural failure. The entire bunker was essentially a complex of concrete tunnels and vaults, poured with high-density, steel-reinforced concrete that used specially sourced aggregate to increase resistance to crushing and spalling, the violent ejection of concrete fragments. The very air the occupants would breathe was engineered for apocalypse. Air handling systems relied on a combination of HEPA filtration and activated charcoal, allowing occupants to breathe safely even under fallout conditions. The air intakes on the surface were minimal and heavily shielded, designed to slam shut instantaneously upon the detection of a nuclear event or the deployment of chemical weapons. Once sealed, the facility's life support switched to an internal, closed-loop system, recycling the air through the enormous filtration banks. HEPA, high-efficiency particulate air, filters. These multi-stage filters were rated to capture radioactive particulates, the microscopic dust of vaporized cities and soil that constituted fallout. They were the primary defense against internal radiation poisoning. Activated charcoal beds. These chemically treated banks were critical for removing radioactive gases, especially the volatile iodine-131, which is readily absorbed by the thyroid and is a major killer in post-nuclear environments. The charcoal beds chemically bound these gases, rendering the air breathable. The engineering was an investment in the unseen. The deepest chambers of the bunker were dedicated not to people, but to power and communication. The deeper sections housed reinforced power conduits and shock-mounted communication lines engineered to withstand electromagnetic pulses. A high-altitude nuclear detonation generates a massive, non-lethal, but utterly crippling surge of energy known as the electromagnetic pulse (EMP). This pulse would instantly overload and fry the sensitive electronics of the outside world, computers, radio transmitters, and power grids, plunging civilization back into the pre-electric age. The engineers of Kaltstall fought this threat with sophisticated, expensive countermeasures. Faraday caging. The entire communications and power core was built into a Faraday cage, a structure shielded by continuous, highly conductive metal sheets, thick steel walls and continuous wire mesh floors that would channel the EMP surge harmlessly around the sensitive internal equipment and into the earth. Shock mounting. All critical electronics, radio racks, message recorders, and battery banks were placed on shock-absorbing spring mounts, designed to isolate them from both the physical ground shock and the internal vibrations of the running diesel generators. Analog reliance. As noted previously, the electronics themselves were deliberately robust and analog. Heavy-duty switches, vacuum tubes, and electromechanical relays were favored over fragile transistors and microchips, giving the bunker a built-in immunity to all but the most extreme EMP surges. The construction of Project Kaltstall was a monument to the ultimate, necessary paranoia of the Cold War. It was a fortress of steel and concrete, not designed to repel invaders, but to defeat the laws of physics and the terrifying finality of the atomic bomb. Once the massive steel doors were sealed and the surface world reduced to a radioactive silence, the true test of Project Kaltstall would begin: the endurance of the human spirit in a manufactured, subterranean existence. Though built for war, the bunker was a fully functioning subterranean habitat. The interior atmosphere was controlled, the lights were always on, and the air was perpetually circulated and recycled. The living environment was intentionally designed to support the maximum duration of isolation possible, which the planners estimated could stretch from 6 weeks to 6 months. The architecture inside was defined by the strict military principle of functional minimalism. Comfort was a luxury sacrificed for space and efficiency. Dormitory rooms with metal bunks, a compact medical station, and a small but efficient kitchen revealed preparations for weeks of isolation. Dormitories were crammed with triple-stacked metal bunks, each with a thin, institutional mattress and a small, adjacent metal locker. There was no personal space, reflecting the mission-first mentality. Every moment spent awake was expected to be dedicated to duty or maintenance. The kitchen galley. This was a high-efficiency processing center, not a restaurant. It was equipped with industrial-grade mixers, heating coils, and vacuum sealing equipment. Its only purpose was to prepare nutritionally complete meals from the bunker's stores with minimal waste and speed. The medical station. As detailed before, this was primarily a triage unit. It housed basic surgical equipment, high-dose antibiotics, and, most crucially, lead-shielded monitoring devices, including sophisticated gamma-ray spectrometers, to track the internal radiation absorption of the personnel. The existence of the medical bay was a constant, grim reminder that even deep underground, the enemy was pervasive and invisible. Decades after the crisis had passed, the evidence of the bunker's chilling purpose remained perfectly preserved. Maps of strategic targets, radio checklists, and sealed fuel drums remained in storage chambers decades later, silent reminders of a world once convinced that survival meant living underground. Strategic maps. The briefing room held not current city maps, but projected target zones and fallout models. One map would show the estimated radius of destruction around a primary target like a capital city, marked in chilling, concentric circles. Total vaporization, heavy firestorm, lethal fallout. Radio checklists. In the communications center, laminated procedures detailed the protocols for the first 3 hours post-strike. The desperate race to establish contact with surviving command assets like hardened bombers or submerged submarines before the EMP effects and atmospheric turbulence completely shut down long-range transmission. Sealed fuel drums. The vast fuel reservoirs ensured the generators could run, but hundreds of tightly sealed, smaller drums held reserve fuel and lubricating oil, stored with military precision, ready to supplement the main tanks in the event of an unexpected leak or extended isolation. The lives of the occupants would have been governed by relentless routine and military discipline, designed to prevent the psychological decay that isolation and existential dread could inflict. Meals would have consisted of long-term ration packs, and the daily routine would have been dictated by radio schedules, equipment maintenance, and constant monitoring of the outside world. Ration packs. The meals were based on high-calorie, dehydrated, and canned rations, often based on compressed protein and carbohydrates. Designed for shelf stability over decades, they offered sustenance, not pleasure. Food became a mechanical requirement of survival. Daily routine. The schedule would have been rigid. Sleep rotation, equipment checks, especially the generators and air filtration, physical training in a small gymnasium, and, most critically, radio watches. The communications teams would maintain continuous, silent listening patrols, tuning sensitive receivers to dozens of frequencies, waiting for the first faint signal from a presumed destroyed world, a signal that would confirm who, and what, had survived the firestorm. The greatest psychological burden would have been the duty to monitor the outside world through the bunker's limited sensors, seismographs tracking the blasts, Geiger counters tracking the radiation, and specialized atmosphere samples tracking the fallout. This constant, impersonal monitoring of the planet's death throes was the price of survival. Project Kaltstall was a monument to the ultimate paradox of the Cold War. The preparation for the failure of humanity became the ultimate testament to the human will to endure. The empty corridors today whisper of the chilling certainty with which one generation prepared to take the reins of a world reduced to ash and rubble. At the very heart of the subterranean citadel, nestled deeper and more securely than the general quarters or the command meeting rooms, was the communications hub. It was the bunker's soul, its ears, and its voice. A room designed not just to survive the unspeakable, but to ensure that in the terrifying, chaotic silence that followed, a single, coherent command could still pierce the void. This was not a sleek, futuristic digital space. It was a cathedral built of analog resilience. The air was thick with the low, continuous hum of power conditioners, the soft, rhythmic click of cooling fans, and the distinctive, slightly metallic scent of warmed electronics and ozone. Lining the reinforced concrete walls were dense, floor-to-ceiling racks, heavy steel frames holding the lifeblood of the nation's post-apocalyptic defense. These were the instruments of command. Not computers, but robust, uncompromising tools engineered for the end of the world. Racks upon racks of analog radio sets, high-frequency HF and very high-frequency VHF transceivers, each unit a piece of military-grade hardware, built to exacting specifications, heavy with vacuum tubes, wiring harnesses, and oversized components that spoke of longevity over elegance. These sets weren't just for chatting. They were the last resort for bridging vast continental distances when all other systems had crumbled to dust. Alongside the radios were the encrypted telephone lines, not the flimsy voice-over IP networks of a later era, but dedicated, physical copper pairs routed through hardened underground conduits. Each line terminated in a thick, matte gray switchboard, manned by operators, usually highly trained military WACs or specialist signalers, who understood that the crackle and hiss in their headsets might be the only remaining link to a surviving submarine fleet, a strategic air command post, or a distant Allied capital. The encryption devices of that era were often room-sized mechanical marvels, known by code names, like the KL-7 or the later Kentucky 3, that whirred and clattered as they scrambled and unscrambled the voices of command, turning them into unintelligible noise for any listener whose antennae weren't connected to an identical machine. Secrecy, after all, was paramount, even in the event of mutual destruction. Then there were the teletype machines. The old workhorses of military and diplomatic communication, these noisy, robust mechanical printers, often heavy Model 28 ASRs or their militarized cousins, sat arranged in orderly rows. They pecked and chattered relentlessly, printing critical, unambiguous text messages onto thick rolls of paper. Text was inherently more reliable than voice over long, compromised circuits. It could be transmitted, received, and read with less risk of misinterpretation or garbling from atmospheric interference or jamming. The relentless clack 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 the teletypes became the bunker's true, continuous heartbeat, a physical manifestation of information flowing even as the world above was perhaps turning to ash. The shield above and the redundancy within. The communications hub was only half the system. Its efficacy relied entirely on the protected antenna array, a critical, vulnerable component that had to be housed above ground yet shielded from detection and destruction. This array was a masterpiece of Cold War camouflage and engineering. Instead of a blatant radio tower, the antennas were typically disguised within the mundane landscape, perhaps embedded within a concrete water tower, concealed beneath a seemingly innocent patch of woodland, or, most ingeniously, woven into the structural integrity of a large, unremarkable barn or warehouse, its lines painted as utility piping or roof supports. The conduits running from the antenna farm back down to the bunker were just as critical. Thick, multi-core cables encased in heavy steel sheathing, buried hundreds of feet deep and snaking through layers of rock and concrete, designed to shrug off the shockwaves of a near miss. The true genius of this nerve center, however, lay in its architecture of redundancy. This was the age of analog, but it was also the age of extreme paranoia, a justifiable fear that a single, well-placed weapon, or even just a component failure, could silence the entire defense apparatus. Every system was duplicated or triplicated to prevent a single point of failure. There wasn't one high-frequency radio set, but a bank of 3, each capable of taking over the entire load. There weren't 2 paths for the main power, but 3, coming from independent generators, running through separate switchgear, all routed to separate, isolated power distribution panels. The very layout of the communication room was sometimes compartmentalized, creating multiple, physically segregated nodes. If one section of the room was taken out by a blast, fire, or systems failure, the signalers could retreat to an adjacent, fully equipped contingency room and continue the broadcast without missing a beat. Built for the nuclear age, this level of robust, analog engineering was a direct, defiant response to the signature threats of the nuclear battlefield. Unlike modern digital systems, with their reliance on integrated circuits that were incredibly vulnerable to sudden surges of energy, these early Cold War networks were built to survive 3 primary killers: high radiation, the electromagnetic pulse (EMP) burst, and the total breakdown of civilian telecommunications. High radiation meant that sensitive components needed heavy shielding and that the components themselves, particularly the vacuum tubes and solid-state parts of the era, were selected for their inherent radiation hardness. The entire structure of the bunker, with its thick concrete and earth overburden, acted as the primary shield, ensuring the equipment and, crucially, the operators remained viable. But the most insidious threat was the EMP. A high-altitude nuclear detonation would generate a colossal, instantaneous surge of electromagnetic energy, a non-thermal effect, that could fry unshielded electronics for hundreds of miles. To counter this, the entire communication suite was enclosed in a Faraday cage, a continuous conductive shell of metal within the concrete walls. Every cable entering or leaving the room passed through complex filtering systems, choke coils and grounding devices, designed to shunt the crippling surge of an EMP harmlessly into the earth, preventing it from incinerating the delicate wiring within. They were designed, in essence, to be an island of electrical calm in a sudden, violent storm of electrons. From this fortified control center, leadership could do the one thing necessary for continuity: they could project authority. They could broadcast orders to surviving military units scattered across the continent. They could coordinate with dispersed defense forces, the bomber wings that had scattered on their fail-safe routes, the missile silos awaiting their launch codes, the naval vessels submerged below the waves. And, perhaps most grimly, they could direct national defenses, the critical, retaliatory response, long after the surface world had been devastated, transforming the chaos of annihilation into a structured, if terrifying, act of last resort governance. The era that forged the bunker was one of stark, binary choices, defined by immediate, existential dread. Yet, as the calendar pages turned past the high watermark of the crisis years, past the 1960s, through the détente of the 1970s, and into the final decade of the Cold War, that intensity began to dissipate. The transition was gradual, almost imperceptible on a day-to-day basis, but cumulatively profound. By the late 1980s, the political landscape had irrevocably shifted. The former adversaries began to speak with a new vocabulary, one of glasnost and perestroika, of arms reduction rather than arms racing. The need for such hyper-hardened, self-sufficient sites, symbols of a commitment to fight after the inevitable first strike, began to evaporate, replaced by a cautious, hopeful pragmatism. New political treaties, historic agreements limiting intermediate-range nuclear forces, scaling back deployed warheads, and increasing mutual verification, reduced the perceived likelihood of the sudden, massive attack the bunker was designed to withstand. Coupled with these diplomatic triumphs came the relentless pressure of budget reductions. Maintaining a facility of this magnitude, a 24/7 operation with climate control, air filtration, power generation, and a rotational staff of specialists, was monumentally expensive. As the perceived threat level dropped, the justification for the cost dissolved. The ultimate, decisive factor, however, was the seismic, world-altering event, the collapse of long-standing hostilities that culminated in the fall of the Berlin Wall and the subsequent disintegration of the opposing political bloc. The entire strategic justification, the core narrative of guaranteed, sudden nuclear aggression, simply ceased to be relevant. The enemy for whom the bunker was built no longer existed in the same form, in the same geographical and political space. Slipping into silence, the bunker, an instrument of fear and resolve, was rendered obsolete. It was too large, too costly, and fundamentally a relic of a strategic doctrine that had passed into history. Its decommissioning was as quiet and meticulous as its construction had been secret. It did not end with a public ceremony or a dedication plaque, it ended with the efficiency of military logistics. It was a process of calculated entropy. The great diesel generators were drained of their thousands of gallons of fuel and coolant, their complex starting systems permanently locked down. The huge stores of filtered water, emergency rations, and medical supplies were inventoried and transferred to active military depots. The secure lines were cut, not just electronically disconnected, but physically severed in the deep conduit tunnels, ensuring that no stray signal could ever again be sent or received. The sensitive communications equipment was carefully removed, the encryption devices either destroyed under strict protocol or placed into deep storage. The heavy steel doors that protected the airlocks and entrances were welded shut from the inside, their multi-ton mechanisms permanently arrested. The earth above was carefully landscaped back to its original appearance. The entrance hatches were covered over with layers of concrete and soil, and the discreet access road was allowed to overgrow, slowly being reclaimed by the wilderness. With no further military or civil purpose, the facility slipped into profound silence. It became a colossal, empty shell, a modern mausoleum to a dark possibility that never materialized. Its existence became a closely guarded secret, known only to a dwindling handful of high-ranking officials and the dedicated military engineers and signalers who had served their quiet, anonymous tours within its concrete confines, a select few who had stood sentinel over an era defined by existential fear. The bunker remains an anomaly, a deep earth memory of a half-century when the greatest effort of human endeavor was directed not towards life on the surface, but towards survival beneath it. It stands as a monument to the fear, and the foresight, of a generation that built its own subterranean insurance policy against Armageddon. I understand the constraints regarding the 20,000-word length. As before, I will significantly expand the provided text into a detailed, high-quality, long-form narrative section, approximately 1,300 words, that maintains the cinematic tone, pacing, and detailed style you requested. This section focuses on the bunker's legacy as a historical artifact, contrasting its intended purpose with its actual, silent history. Part 7. A monument to a war that never happened. The legacy of a silent fortress, the architecture of anxiety. Today, the bunker stands as one of the Cold War's strangest and most poignant relics, a subterranean fortress prepared for a conflict that never erupted. It is an artifact of pure potential energy, a massive piece of national infrastructure designed for zero-hour functionality that instead experienced 60 years of near-perfect inertia. When one finally steps inside, past the layered security and the massive, rusted blast doors, one doesn't encounter the ghosts of battle, but the heavy, dust-sheeted atmosphere of suspended animation. This quiet, concrete tomb represents far more than just a decommissioned military site. It is a tangible, three-dimensional ledger of the immense resources a nation was willing to commit to survival. The sheer financial investment, the millions, and later billions, poured into raw materials, specialized equipment, and skilled manpower, was staggering. This money didn't build roads or hospitals, it was sunk deep into the earth, dedicated entirely to the hypothesis of Armageddon. It stands, too, as a testament to profound engineering ambition. The engineers who designed these sites faced challenges previously reserved for mining operations or deep-sea vessels. How to maintain breathable air for hundreds of people after the atmosphere outside was poisoned. How to generate enough power to run a complete command structure for months without surface resupply. How to isolate delicate electronic circuits from a continent-wide electromagnetic shockwave. They solved these problems with heavy, over-designed, and often ingenious analog technology, creating systems that defied the scale of the impending disaster. The bunker is a monument to the practical problem-solving that happens when the stakes are literally everything. Most powerfully, it embodies the psychological tension of the Cold War period. Every meter of concrete, every welded steel girder, every can of emergency rations was an expression of deep, collective fear. The people who authorized, designed, and staffed these bunkers did so because they genuinely believed their existence was a matter of national destiny. This tension was a constant, low-frequency hum running beneath the surface of everyday life, a tension that necessitated building shelters large enough to hold the government and military apparatus, ready to resume order and launch retaliation from a depth of hundreds of feet. The unwritten history. In its entire operational lifetime, a span measured in decades of high alert, the facility never housed wartime personnel. It never saw the desperate, chaotic arrival of the high command or the president fleeing a city under fire. It never underwent the true, gut-wrenching moment of transition from quiet readiness to active, emergency deployment. The silence of the halls was never broken by the shouted commands of coordination, the frantic ringing of telephones, or the continuous clacks relaying target confirmations. Similarly, it never coordinated emergency responses. It was built to organize survival, to manage the terrifying aftermath of societal breakdown, but the switchboards remained quiet and the giant maps in the command center never had to be marked with casualty estimations or fallout plumes. Its air filtration system, capable of scrubbing radioactive particulates from the intake air, never had to perform its core function. Its massive diesel engines, designed to roar into life and run continuously for months, never faced the necessity of true, uninterrupted operation while the world outside crumbled. The fortress never faced the fire it was designed to resist. The warhead was never launched in anger, the blast wave never reached the reinforced concrete walls, and the electromagnetic pulse was never generated. For the bunker, the Cold War was a rehearsal that never reached opening night. The time capsule effect, and this is what makes the bunker so utterly unique. It is preserved not by active conservation, but by neglect, a time capsule hermetically sealed and removed from the flow of history. To walk its corridors now is to step back into a frozen moment of the 1970s or 80s, depending on when its decommissioning occurred. The paint on the walls is the drab, institutional olive green or pale blue of that era. The control panels are filled with heavy-duty toggle switches, amber indicator lights, and dials with analog needles. You might find a stack of outdated technical manuals printed on thick, rough paper, or perhaps a calendar on a desk, frozen on a date 2 decades ago. In the command center, the vast maps are still affixed to the walls, showing the geopolitical boundaries and strategic locations of a world that no longer exists in that configuration. The red and blue markers, the colored string lines indicating potential fronts or attack corridors, are still in place, displaying strategic assumptions rendered moot by the fall of political systems. Everything is heavy, solid, and reliable, a testament to a design philosophy that prioritized function and longevity over cost or aesthetics. This preserved state offers irrefutable proof of how far humanity was willing to go to prepare for the ultimate disaster. It shows the incredible, almost unimaginable lengths to which two opposing political systems would go to ensure that, should one strike the other, the retaliatory capacity would survive intact. It highlights the profound, fundamental belief that societal existence might hinge on the survival of a small group of leaders and a robust communications network deep underground. The true triumph of the bunker. Yet, the bunker's true story is one of a glorious failure. Its perfect preservation is, paradoxically, its greatest victory. It exists as a monument not to the savagery of war, but to the collective, nerve-wracking forbearance of the nuclear age. It is a monument to diplomacy, treaty, and the slow, arduous process of de-escalation that allowed the world to step back from the precipice. This silent, empty structure is the concrete embodiment of a terrible future the world ultimately avoided. It is the physical shadow of a nightmare that passed, leaving behind only the cold, impenetrable walls of the fortress that waited in vain. Its purpose was to survive the end of the world. Its legacy is that its services were never needed. And in the history of human conflict, there are few monuments to a non-event that are quite so massive, quite so expensive, or quite so deeply profound. It is the fortress that stands as a silent thank you to peace.